Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. This is the series of videos that I do on ancient well not so ancient, battles. So it's a military history type thing where we look at battles from throughout history where the historical account just doesn't line up very well with what appears to be the reality. And it can be propaganda or whatever the case may be back in the day. But I like to revisit these battles and say, well, on a balance of probability, the likelihood was that this is what happened rather than what the histories claim. And remember, some of these histories are written many years later. Now, I've got some text that I've written up here, and I'm going to add to this through just ad-libbing from here and there. Now, to set the scene, this is about the Battle of Cannae. So Cannae is a town about 400 kilometres southeast of Rome in Italy, and it's fought between the Carthaginian army of General Hannibal Barca and the Roman army that was jointly commanded by the consuls, sort of like the prime ministers, I guess you'd call it, which are Varro and Paulus. Now, the leading political leaders were also often doubled as generals or senior administrators in the armed forces. Now, this Battle of Cannae in 216 BC resulted in a crushing one-sided victory for the Carthaginians and their general Hannibal Barca. The battle is rightly seen, given that the Romans had superiority in many of the key areas. The battle is rightly seen as an all-time masterpiece of generalship by the Carthaginian general Hannibal, and is studied even today in military colleges all around the world as being a masterpiece of organisation and structure and leadership. It is probably, if not the studied, is one of the top 10 studied battles of all time in military history terms. So let's have a look at this incredible victory from where the Roman army was superior in most areas, certainly numerically, and yet still they got very soundly thrashed at this battlefield. Now, the battle produced more than 80,000 casualties in less than 10 hours. Can you imagine that? I mean, there's no machine guns and bombs going off, and in 80,000 casualties in less than 10 hours on that day in August 2016 BC. An incredible death count for the times. And those levels of deaths in a single day, they weren't really surpassed until the meat grinder machine gun type industrial battles of World War I. That's just how huge this battle was in casualty terms. Even so, the description of the battle accounts that have survived for more than 2,200 years, many of those accounts being recalled after the event or from people that interviewed the few survivors, it doesn't really hold up today, those battle accounts, to serious scrutiny. Too many questions remain and too many questions are unanswered to this very day. So to really find out what happened, we need to look deeper and ask more questions and consider, again, balance of probabilities in the event that there aren't details to cover what did and didn't happen. So by looking at the chain of events and those balance of probabilities, I'm trying to determine what actually happened on that day, or again, what probably happened on that day, and the build-up to the battle. The histories, in my view, only don't even give us half the picture, really. How did an inferior force defeat a much superior force, or in many ways a superior force? It was such a crushing one-sided victory. If it wasn't like it was a close thing, or it was a draw, or it was one side just managed to push the other off. No, this was a crushing victory. And how was an inferior force able to defeat such a superior force and having such a one-sided outcome? Now, did Hannibal's victory lie primarily in exceptional battlefield generalship? It was certainly the case that Hannibal was an above-average general. There's no doubt about that. Was the victory, the Carthaginian victory, down to concealed ambush-type cunning, as the Romans imply? The cunning of the inferior, the deceitful, treacherous sort of person doing up to cunning tricks, not like the good Romans that would stand up man to man. The Roman histories imply this to some extent. Was the result of victory just a blundering bunch of Roman amateurs that just didn't know what they were doing? None of these things sort of really hold up. The Romans had recognised as the most professional army in the world. They were hardly a bunch of blundering amateurs. Now, what I'm going to argue here is that Hannibal, while being a good general, especially in the area of leadership and commanding loyalty, he was exceptional there. I don't believe he was particularly exceptional outside of that. He wasn't a bum or anything like that. He was certainly an above-average general. But what I will argue in this article is that Hannibal, in fact, ran one of the most effective military intelligence operations ever seen in the ancient world, and that this was primarily a very key source of his victories. Now, the details, or the accepted details of this battle, are that approximately 45,000 Carthaginians, many of whom, by the way, were lightly armed and had little or no armour at all, that they defeated a heavily armed army, about close to double the size. So 45,000 Carthaginians, many of whom were lightly armed, managed to defeat 85,000 heavily armed, very well equipped Romans. Now that just on paper alone, this likelihood seems rather distant and remote. Further, that the Carthaginian army was an unwieldy multinational army of Gauls, Carthaginians, what today would be Spaniards, islanders from the Mediterranean, and Numidians. I mean, the list goes on. At least 6 different languages were spoken in the Carthaginian army, whereas only one language in the Roman. Not that there weren't different dialects in the Roman army, there were, but one language in the Roman army. So the officers of the army were made up of Carthaginians, many of whom didn't speak the language of the troops they were directing. The loyalty of these troops was to Hannibal personally, and given you got multiple races of people, many of whom don't really get on that well, but they're loyal to the general Hannibal. Even that to command that level of loyalty, and to get all these different parties to agree to pursue the objectives that Hannibal sets for them, that in itself is a monumental achievement, and again is very central to why Hannibal was a successful general. That he could command such intense loyalty from these people could be a separate study in itself. Now the Roman officers, of course, spoke one language, making training, command, orders and so on much easier, and this would have given the Romans a huge battlefield advantage. By the time, if you want to sort of, on the Carthaginian side, you want to get those guys there to go and, no, don't go that way, go this way. Then you've got to find someone that speaks their language, then you get someone they know. And so, I mean, that in itself, whereas the Romans accepted a chain of command, and again spoke that same language. That is a massive difference on a battlefield. Now, in addition to that, the Romans pretty much selected the battlefield. The general area was selected, you could argue, by Hannibal, but the battlefield itself was selected by the Romans, so they had the battlefield advantage they picked the battlefield, and they had high hills on one side to prevent flanking operations by the Carthaginian cavalry, and on the other side they had a reasonably fast-flowing and deep river, which would then prevent them being outflanked across the water, or the river course. Now this again was another quite significant advantage to the Romans. The battlefield itself, given the distance between the hills and the river, was about close to 4,000 metres left to right. And if you look at the number of soldiers in the Roman army, the front battle line would have been approximately, give or take, 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers across, which meant they'd have had to have been, again, depending on those numbers, 35 to 50 soldiers deep. So it's quite a long and deep sort of contingent there. This depth, rather than width, but on depth, was quite a bit more than usual. But it gave the Romans an advantage here. Again, their heavy infantry is much better equipped and trained, and so they had the advantage there of giving extra weight to the momentum of any advance of their infantry, and also the cohesion of their infantry formations. By comparison, the Carthaginian line was held by minimal or moderately trained Gallic infantry. Many of them didn't have any armour, and they had heavy swords that were suited to individual combat rather than the short jab belly thrust, gladius sword that the Romans used, which was good for close in combat, striking at legs and again the belly thrusts. So the Romans were much better armoured. Not that the Gauls, the Gallic infantry didn't have some armour, or the North African infantry didn't have armour. They did, not to the same extent or same quality as the Romans. Now the Roman heavy infantry, of which there was a big contingent at Cannae, they'd done quite well in the two previous encounters with the Carthaginians. This is the Roman defeats at Trebia and then Trasimene Lakes, while the Roman cavalry and light infantry and skirmisher troops had been routed or sent to flight on those battles. The Roman heavy infantry, by and large, had held formation and had withdrawn from the battlefield in good order to fight again. Not that they hadn't had casualties, they did. So many of the Roman infantry at Cannae were survivors of the two previous battles. So at least 25,000 of them, depending on whose numbers you want to look at, were battlefield experience fighting the Carthaginians and so on. So the idea that a bunch of green, untried, untrained troops were at Cannae and that gave the Carthaginians an advantage simply isn't true. These many Roman heavy infantry, and particularly the officers and equivalents of the sergeants and so on, were experienced battlefield heavy infantry, and again they were well armoured and well equipped. Now, the Romans considered the heavy infantry as the key to beating Hannibal, and they thought if we've got enough heavy infantry and they maintain formation, then we'll beat Hannibal. And the Romans knew Hannibal's infantry were Gallic and North Africa, and the one for one, the Romans were just better equipped, better trained, better led, really in this sense. Now, if the infantry kept tight formation, the Romans believed, and they marched in tight formation so that they couldn't be surprised by ambush or something like that. They believed they could win, and they could, overwhelming the less numerous and lightly armoured Carthaginian infantry, break through the centre of the Carthaginian formations, which, by the way, they'd done previously at the Battle of Trebia in 218 BC in northern Italy. So they figured they could do the same thing. So once they'd broken through the centre, then they could wind up the Carthaginian left and right, and then it would which would give them a great victory, and they could vanquish this Hannibal guy once and for all. It wasn't an imaginative plan. It relied on simply the brute force of a numerically superior, better armed, better equipped infantry to just bulldoze their way through. So we're not talking about brilliant generalship on the part of the Romans, but it wasn't a dumb plan. It was reasonably sensible given those circumstances, and particularly given their previous experience in fighting Hannibal. Now, the way it worked in the battle sort of fields of the day was that the skirmishers, the guys throwing spears and arrows, and in the Carthaginian case, the slingers, they were placed out front, and they would harass and frustrate the enemy front lines, and the slingers that the Carthaginians used as skirmishers, they would often carry three different slings, one for long distance, medium and short distance, and using sort of smaller size stones, river stones, that sort of thing. They could get a distance of 400 yards on those, whereas the Romans, with their bows and arrows and their javelins, were really confined to sort of 150 yards or less. So the Carthaginians, and Hannibal acknowledged this, that the slingers could keep the Roman skirmishers further back, which made them, of course, less effective. The Roman skirmishers less effective on the battlefield. The cavalry were put to the left and right, sort of the wings, as it was called, of the infantry. So you've got a big bulk of infantry in the middle, cavalry at either side, and the skirmishers out front. The skirmishers, as the front lines of the infantry start to get closer, the skirmishers fall back between the gaps of the infantry, and then the infantry front lines meet. Now, it's easy to imagine how confident the Romans must have been. They've got a close to 2-to-1 numerical advantage, many battle-seasoned troops, better armour, better equipment, better swords, and they had a choice of battlefield. Also, they had plentiful supplies. From the Roman perspective, how can we lose? When they looked at the previous two defeats that they'd suffered from Hannibal, and both times Hannibal had used ambush to great effect, and so the Romans figured if we can keep the infantry formations intact, we can avoid being ambushed, then we're going to win. And they were fixated very much on keeping a tight formation, and with the hills on one side and the river on the other, they figured they could avoid any ambushes which Hannibal had used again to great effect. The histories describe the Roman general Varro as an impetuous hothead, and his co-general Paulus as excessively cautious. I don't think this adds up. Was Paulus more cautious than Varro? Possibly. That would seem to be the case, but it seems that he was a cautious, hesitant man generally, and Varro was looking for decisive battle. Now, both generals had been sent out by the Roman Senate, go out, find Hannibal and beat him, defeat him in the field. That was their job, that was their mission. So, of course, they were looking for battle. Now, the idea that by seeking battle, it was supposed to indicate they were Varro was a hothead who shouldn't have rushed into battle. I don't accept that at all. Those were the instructions from the Senate. And it's hugely expensive to an army of that size, over 80,000 men, supplying them and paying them, and to have an army of that size running around and in the field for as long as that had been was costing vast sums of money. As the Roman Senate sort of would comment, the sinews of war are infinite money, and even even Roman commentators and politicians later on, like Cicero and Seneca, were saying the same thing, that wars are horrendously expensive and keeping huge armies in the field. And this was no different here. So the Roman Senate was saying, get a decisive battle here. Don't take forever here, guys. Can you get on with it? This is like really expensive. And we're going to have to increase taxes. The populace is going to not like it, and all this sort of thing. So Varro, as being a politician and a general, was there to get a decisive battle and not drag feet in doing it. So the idea he was some silly hothead that rushed into battle, I don't accept that. I don't think that's right at all. Now the Roman dispositions for the battle at Cannae were sensible enough. I mean, they weren't imaginative, but they weren't unsound. And the confidence that Varro and the other senior officers had in that day on battle in August 2016 was not misplaced. It wasn't, again, amateurs or people not knowing what they're doing. The Roman army was the most formidable army in the world. Why wouldn't they have a degree of confidence? I mean, they would and they should. Now, Hannibal had a level of self-belief and assurance that suggests superhuman levels of capability and confidence. What gave Hannibal the confidence that he could beat an army twice his size that was better equipped and better supplied? And how did he believe that he could win it as easily as he appeared to? I don't think he did, but again, it comes back to this thing. Hannibal, I believe, ran one of the best military intelligence operations ever seen in the ancient world, and that even today we can look at it with awe. He seemed to know exactly what the Romans would do, when they would do it, how they would do it, the limitations of what they would do. He seemed to know that they won't detach troops from this section to go and fight over there. He knew exactly what the orders they were, that they would stick to the orders, that they would not change the orders. There were so many things that Hannibal had to be sure of and had to rely on in order to achieve this victory at Cannae. And also at Trasimene Lakes, by the way. Less so at Trebia, but still even there we see this. So Hannibal's concept, or Hannibal's idea of military intelligence, was know exactly what your enemy will do, what the orders they've given are, the limits of those orders, the amount of discretion the commanders have, and and so on. So Hannibal knew this and could make a battle plan around his fully confident knowledge of what the Romans would and wouldn't do, down to really some detail levels. Now. The Roman, or the battle arrangement Hannibal had, rested on a fairly flexible minute-by-minute adjustable planning. The coordination of the Hannibal's forces was the timing of it and the application of it was on a knife edge. Now, nobody would take those sort of risks, which were huge risks, unless they were very confident of certain key things that the Romans would and wouldn't do, which brings us back to the intelligence. Hannibal's infantry was inferior to the Roman infantry. His cavalry was superior, so his slingers had better distance, so the skirmishing capacity was greater. But the heavy infantry, which would the Romans were, and typically does decide battles in most instances. The heavy infantry, Hannibal was hugely outnumbered by better trained, better equipped soldiers, and so to be supremely confident, as Hannibal appears to be. Also, the history suggests, and his behaviour on the battlefield certainly suggests, he was supremely confident that the Romans would do exactly what he wanted them to do, and therefore he could plan around knowing that in advance, which includes the timing and execution of his own plan. So, again, this leads us to believe, or leads me to believe at least, that military intelligence was the issue. Now, Hannibal's battlefield dispositions were the Gallic infantry. Again, many of whom had no armour, had formed a crescent shape, like a bulging out semicircle that pointed towards the Roman lines, and that the orders were that these Gallic infantry, again, we're talking multiple languages here in this infantry, Gallic infantry, North African, and so on, that infantry was to give ground slowly. And so they would, instead of being a bulging out semicircle, they would then start to give ground so they would be bulging in. So trying to draw the Romans into the centre so they could come around the sides to form the beginning of an encirclement. But again, the Romans are far more numerous than... Now, the extra numbers the Romans had, of course, being that they were in a narrow area, narrow plain, meant that the numbers were reflected in the depth rather than the width of the infantry lines. So even though the Carthaginians were less numerous because it was in a concentrated area, the Romans couldn't fully apply the extra numbers and then come around the flanks or the sides. They had to push through by brute force down the middle, which they could do. and ultimately did begin to do here. So, but now you have to, the Carthaginians had to keep that infantry line, the one that was giving ground slowly and going from a bulging out semicircle into one that was bulging in. And they had to do that without falling apart, without disintegrating. They had to do all that to a time frame that worked for the other actions on the battlefield, such as the Carthaginian cavalry. So this was the cavalry had to make it back in time from chasing the Roman cavalry away. They had to make it to come back at the Romans from the rear to complete the encirclement. Now the timing of that has to be exquisite. How can you keep a less armoured, less numerous infantry line and have it time almost perfectly to give ground unless you have a number of very fixed plannable points around what the Romans will and won't do? If the Romans had deviated even slightly from their plan, the whole battle could have been different. But Hannibal knew what the Romans would do, and the discretion that the Roman commanders had to change the plan. Now the way Hannibal he wanted the cavalry on his left, which is the heavier cavalry, to rout the Roman cavalry and drive them from the battlefield. And then that Carthaginian cavalry was to return from chasing the Romans off and to take out the Roman cavalry on Hannibal's right. So the cavalry to his left chases off the Roman cavalry. It then comes back to the battlefield. It routs in conjunction with the Carthaginian light cavalry, which is really missile cavalry. Together they rout the Roman cavalry on Hannibal's right side, and then they attack the Roman infantry from the rear. That was effectively the battle plan. So now we run into sort of various levels of incredulity here. Hannibal's battle plan, to call it high risk was understating it by some large degree. Now he could be confident that the Numidian cavalry was good quality cavalry. They'd routed the Romans in the past. He was confident the Romans hadn't made any necessary training or other weapon type adjustments to their cavalry structure, so that he was still confident the Numidians could easily rout them. But he had no idea how long it would take. Would the Roman cavalry put up a good fight? Could they be driven from the field quickly? Would they maintain cohesion as they were riding away? How long would the Numidian cavalry need to go chasing the Romans to make sure they were completely gone from the battlefield and wouldn't reform and come back? Hannibal has no idea how long this will take. It could take an hour or so. It could take more than that. What if the Carthaginian cavalry has to chase the Romans away for 10 miles at high speed with skirmishes and battles all the way? The horses and the riders will be exhausted. They'll be useless for anything for hours. How does Hannibal know that's not going to happen? So this is the level of risk Hannibal's plan has in it. Now and in the fog of war and on a dry plain, just how long will it take for his cavalry to come back? Even when they return to the battlefield, the dust on that dry, hot August day, Hannibal can't even see the cavalry arriving or in what numbers or in what condition they're going to be in. So again, I want to illustrate by saying this, just the element or the amount of risk that's built into Hannibal's plan. You don't have to just be confident of the intelligence. You have to be supremely confident in your sub-commanders and so on that they're going to deliver as you expect. And Hannibal gave his generals quite a bit of discretion. So if you need to chase the Roman cavalry for longer, do it. Just make sure they don't come back to the battlefield. But that could add an hour onto things. And meanwhile, this infantry line that's heavily outnumbered by the Romans, it's slowly giving ground. But if the cavalry takes too long to come back, that infantry line will disintegrate. The battle's over. The Carthaginians will be thoroughly thrashed and defeated. Every minute before the cavalry return could be enough where the vastly superior Roman infantry defeat the mainly Gallic infantry that are facing them. Again, it's a knife-edge, balancing act here. And even if the cavalry came 15 minutes later, or half an hour later than minutes later, the battle could have been completely different. And it's hard to fathom what appears to be Hannibal's unshakable confidence, given these multiple knife-edge issues here. Now, Hannibal must have had nerves of steel to sort of stay with this, but. And supposedly Hannibal was described as being right in the middle of the action on the infantry front lines. Now, whether he was right in the front fighting, I don't know. I mean, his death could have been the end of everything, so I would have thought it was overly risky that he would be right at the front of that. Nonetheless, he was in amongst the infantry on those front lines, giving orders, shouting encouragement and so on. And given the confusion and the melee and, again, the dust on that dusty plain on a hot day, it's lucky if he had even 100 metres view of the battlefield. Therefore, many things were happening without his knowledge or without his understanding of the details. And if he's out in the front there fighting, he can hardly be calmly sitting back and making orders. and there was micro timing of the actions needed on the battlefield. How was Hannibal able to do that? Now, it's certainly worth going over the list of variables that Hannibal had to sort of oversee, and again, he must have been supremely confident of and had foreknowledge of many aspects of the Roman battle plan, and again, the discretion the commanders wouldn't have had in order to make his own plans. And this again, coming back to Hannibal had no idea how long it would take the Roman cavalry, the Carthaginian cavalry, to drive the Roman cavalry from the field. But they didn't just have to drive from the field; they had to disperse the cavalry. They had to be completely confident the Roman cavalry wouldn't reform and come back to the battlefield. This was essential. They had to drive them from the field and make sure they weren't in a state to reform. Now, what would have happened if the cavalry on Hannibal's right, which were heavy cavalry again, and they only had light Numidian cavalry to pin them in place? The only heavy cavalry contingent Hannibal had was chasing the Romans off on the other side. But what happened if part of, or some of the heavy cavalry from Hannibal's right went off to assist their comrades on the left? The cavalry contingent on the left side of Hannibal's formation. What if that happened? That could have changed the whole thing, or it could have turned into an exhausting battle for the Carthaginian cavalry, and again, they'd have been no shape to come back to the battlefield. They'd have been exhausted and worn out. As it turns out, they twice had to stop to reform, water the horses and rest the horses and the men before joining the battle. So this is again the extent of it. But Hannibal knew that Roman format, commanded by Varro, incidentally, the cavalry on the Roman on Hannibal's right. He knew that they would not break formation and go to help their comrades, and that meant that he had to know the battle plan in detail, which again comes back to this intelligence that he had. Now, the cavalry on Hannibal's right was skirmisher cavalry, so they could only harass, not defeat, the Roman heavy cavalry on Hannibal's right. But what happened if the heavy cavalry on Hannibal's right decided to charge the Carthaginian light cavalry, and then they could have outflanked the Carthaginian infantry? But this didn't happen. The Romans stayed doggedly put, didn't move, and without that was an essential part of Hannibal's victory. Just that alone, the cavalry on the Roman heavy cavalry on Hannibal's right sticking tightly in place. This was a key aspect to the victory. Now, something that I can't quite work out here is that the Roman infantry did not begin to advance until late morning. So it's close to midday, and it's on the hottest part of the day, and they're carrying around 60 pounds. This is the Roman infantry, carrying around 60 pounds of kit. And Hannibal decides pretty much to stay put. The skirmishers are told to create as much dust, and it's a hot, dusty day, on the plain. Now, from what I understand, the sun is going east-west, and the troops are facing north-south. So the sun being in the eyes or anything like that wasn't. So I don't know why the Romans waited so late before starting the advance of their infantry. That's not clear. But anyway, now the Roman attempts to gather water from. Remember, their troops abutted the river. They're directly abutted the river. So why they would struggle to get water is not clear. The allegation or the claims are that slingers and so on, light harassment troops from the Carthaginians harassed the Romans as they tried to get water. But the Romans had a military contingent on the other side of the river, so a camp with so I don't know why or how that could have been a problem, but it was cited as one where the Romans were frustrated in gathering water for their soldiers. But let's have a look at here. You've got they were 2 hours slow march in tight formation. So in tight formation, there's the soldiers can't march very fast in tight formation, particularly on a hot day carrying that sort of weight, and they're wearing full armour and so on. And they've got a tighter than normal march formation because they don't want to break formation. To the Roman cognizance, breaking formation, the infantry, breaking formation is going to be very dangerous for them. So they're they're marching in tight formation, which isn't a good idea. They probably expected Hannibal to march towards them, but it looks like that didn't happen, or at least Hannibal's march was very brief, and the Romans had to march for over 2 hours in that heat, in that tight formation, and the formation apparently was so tight that the Roman water carriers couldn't deliver water to the troops. So Now, by the time the Romans arrive at the Carthaginian front lines, where the two front lines of infantry meet, they've been marching for 2 hours in that sort of heat, carrying that sort of weight, wearing full armour. They'd have been exhausted by the time, they wouldn't have been in fighting condition by the time they'd covered that sort of distance, breathing in that amount of dust. And the sort of description is that Hannibal, they say that the Romans picked the battle plan, but then the battle location, but then suggest that Hannibal really picked it because the wind was blowing north-south, or was blowing to the north where the Romans were located, and if enough dust was kicked up on that dusty plain, that would blow the dust through the wind, that would blow the dust into the face of the advancing Romans in that sort of heat. Now, if the Romans had decided to stop or regroup or redistribute the troops or re-water the troops on the way, again, Hannibal's entire plan would have got up in smoke, but the Romans stayed tight to the script that Hannibal seemed to already know about in detail before it started. Again, these are critical things Hannibal had to know in order not just to organise his own dispositions, but to pull off this stunning victory. Now, there's a decent chance, because of the dust that was kicked up, that the Romans didn't know that the Carthaginian line had that semicircle outward bulge. So when they came close enough to realise it, they would have been under strict orders not to break formation. Now, if the Romans had decided to fold around the bulging, the outward bulging semicircle, the Carthaginians would have been defeated almost immediately. The Romans, with their numerical superiority, would have routed the Carthaginian line. For some reason, they didn't. Instead, they held tight left-right formation, and this is what allowed the Carthaginians to slowly give ground. Well, only really a small proportion of their infantry was actually in contact with the front line of the Roman infantry, so they could slowly give ground until they were parallel, left-right parallel to the Roman, and then go convex, go have an inward bulge which would draw the Roman. Now, at that point, only at that point did the Romans lose formation. They started to come inwards into the inward bulging infantry line of the Carthaginians, and that was the beginning. How did Hannibal know they would do that? It could have been a guess, but again, it was an absolutely essential component of organising victory here that the Romans did that. If they decided to stick rigidly to left-right formation, much of Hannibal's envelopment strategy tactics that he'd planned, that wouldn't have taken place if the Romans had held. Remember, they'd held strict sort of left-right tight formation, and only at this point, as the Carthaginians gave ground, did the Roman battle plan. Now, some of this would have been the Romans sensing victory. Are they giving ground? They're about to break. They're about to fall to pieces. Let's really push it home and show these bums who's boss and that. So that could have been very that. But again, how did Hannibal know that? They'd stayed tightly formed up until then. Only at that point did they start to. Now, the front battle lines, again, you're looking at exhausted Roman soldiers that have had to march for over 2 miles to get to the Carthaginian front line. Most of them haven't had water. It's a hot day. They wouldn't be in. Now, they're so tightly packed that they can't rotate their troops effectively. So typically there's the frontline soldier fights for, depending on how intense the fight is, the frontline soldier fights for a couple of minutes, then he drops back and the next guy in the line and they rotate them around. Each column gets rotated around, so there's always a fresh soldier doing the fighting. But this was apparently quite seriously disrupted, and because they were packed so tight, the Romans, they weren't able to rotate their soldiers, so that the people on the front, the soldier on the front line, would get exhausted and would either be ineffective and not be able to do anything, or they'd only be replaced by a fresher soldier when they were killed. But they were all fairly the Romans fairly exhausted after that exhausting long march in the midday heat. Now, in addition, given the dust on the plain, which again Hannibal was counting on and using, the North African infantry was able to move into position around the flanks and be ready to pounce once the trap had been sprung. Now, you could say that had a form of ambush in it. I don't know how effective that was. Apparently vision was substantially less than 100 yards given the dust. So it's quite possible that the extent of the North African troops at the shoulders or the edges, if you like, of the Gallic infantry that were giving ground, that the Romans wouldn't fully appreciate or understand what was going on there. I guess that's possible. Now, the Gallic infantry weren't known for tight fighting discipline, and how they could be counted on to deliver perfect discipline for hours under such pressure is near inconceivable. So how Hannibal achieved that is a masterpiece of loyalty and generalship. But again, it comes from Hannibal's confidence of what the Romans would and wouldn't do. Now, given the impact of the Roman numerical advantage wasn't initially obvious, because the Carthaginians, because the width of the battlefield, being 2,500 soldiers across, that even though they were better equipped, the Romans were better equipped and armoured, and many had battle experience, and fired up by patriotism of homeland, again, it seems inconceivable that Hannibal's Gallic troops could have held so effectively in the face of such advantages held by the Romans. But again, I would argue that the Romans, in fact, were so exhausted by the time they'd done their 2-mile march in that heat and in that dust, and without adequate water supplies, that they had ceased to be an effective foe. They were minimally effective. They still were well armoured and equipped, but their effectiveness was so substantially reduced that the Gallic infantry was able to hold formation for much longer than would have ordinarily been the case. So Hannibal knew a lot of things about what the Romans would do. How did he get such intelligence? How was he able to determine what was reliable? I mean, military intelligence has been around forever. What's reliable? How reliable? What if they change their minds and change their plans on the day of battle? What if local commanders have a certain discretion to do this or do that? All of these things. Yet Hannibal was able to get intelligence and was able to rely on it pretty much 100%. I mean, he had the spy network and intelligence network to rival all networks. And again, I would argue that the victory here, and I would argue at Trasimene Lakes in 2017 BC, the victory at Cannae was largely due to exquisite and accurate, reliable intelligence. Not to take it away from Hannibal's generalship, but once you take the intelligence out of the quality of intelligence information out of the battle plan, then I think it's reasonable to assume Hannibal would have been defeated there, given the disadvantages and the extent to which he was outnumbered on that day. Now, in the flow of things, the Carthaginian cavalry on Hannibal's left, the heavy cavalry, excuse me, did rout and disperse the Roman cavalry, but it was quite a chase and quite a battle. So they had to stop, rest, reform, and water the horses, and so on and so forth. The troops had to have a rest. The soldiers had. Then they had to come back and they had to fight the Roman cavalry on Hannibal's right wing, right side. So the Numidian cavalry comes back, the heavy cavalry comes back, that previously had been at Hannibal's left. They come back and rout the Roman cavalry on the right. Now, this battle doesn't take as long, because the Roman cavalry on the right's really surrounded by, on one side, the Numidian light missile cavalry that's with slingers and javelin throwers and so on and so forth, and then the heavy. So they get dispersed reasonably quickly, but still it's an intense battle. The consul Varro is killed in the exchange. So then the heavy cavalry again has to stop. It has to reform, it has to water, and so now all this is time going on here. Now, if we look at the time it takes for the Roman infantry to march and cover the distance, and which is why Hannibal stayed put, he was playing for time. So the Romans, it took over 2 hours for that. So that's the window Hannibal's got. He's got, give or take, 2.5 hours to work with, and in that time, the Numidian cavalry has to defeat the cavalry on Hannibal's left, has to rest, reform, refit, and water, come back, defeat the Roman cavalry on Hannibal's right, in conjunction with the light cavalry, again has to rest, refit, reform. Now they fought 2 battles in give or take 2 hours or so, and then they have to come back and attack the Roman infantry from the rear, and this has to be coordinated and timed with the North African infantry attacking the Roman flanks as the Roman infantry has gone inside the Gallic bulge, as the infantry concedes ground in the middle. So all these things have to line up. The Gallic infantry have to hold the line as they retreat. The Romans have to get suckered into falling into the middle there and losing formation. The North African infantry in the dust, the Romans have not to see that, or have to miss it, or not get fully comprehend its implications for the battlefield. The North African infantry then come and attack the flank. The cavalry come out for the rear in what has to be top quality pinpoint timing, and all this has to happen in, depending on how generous you want to be, somewhere between 2 and 3 hours from the time the Numidian cavalry charges the Roman cavalry on Hannibal's left. They've got to win 2 cavalry battles, rest, reform, water the horse, do all that, and then they've got to come back to the main battlefield and then fully surround the Roman. Now, once the Romans are surrounded, then you've got the business of having to then rotate your troops on, fighting battles and stabbing, waving swords around, holding shields. That's exhausting, especially in that heat and that dust on the day in August. So troops have to be rotated. They're already tired troops that fought 2 battles have to come back and then fight another battle. And that's the extent of the fatigue that these soldiers be under. So to then surround the Roman armies and again kill over 70,000 of them, or give or take, that's an astonishing feat, an astonishing accomplishment. Now my view is that the least experienced, greenest Roman troops would have been at the rear, and the most experienced troops at the front. And so the most experienced troops were exhausted, and even though they pretty much had successfully broken through the Carthaginian centre, they only achieved this breakthrough at the precise moment, pretty much, that they were surrounded. And so as the Gallic infantry was starting to run from the battlefield, they were chased down by Carthaginian officers, said, "Hey, hold on, the Romans are surrounded, come back, help us kill some of these Romans." So now the Roman battle plans, to say the least, were inflexible, and they believed that their strength, that if we keep formation tight, if the heavy infantry stays tight, we'll win this. So the very discretion that frontline commanders, many of them experienced, by the way, needed to adjust their battle plans, they weren't given that sort of discretion. Now the whole thing for Hannibal was a huge gamble. Again, that the time taken for the cavalry to return to the battlefield. What if the cavalry hadn't returned to the battlefield? What if they'd been caught up fighting the Romans for miles and miles? What if that had happened? Then the whole battle plan would have fallen to pieces. So all these things that had to fall neatly into place, and the amount of gambling there. So the only way Hannibal would run such risks is if he was absolutely sure of what the Romans would do. So the river was the Ofanto River, just to Hannibal's left or to the Romans' right as they faced up on that day. But at the end of the day, as nightfall came, the Romans were being killed at the rate of more than 10,000 per hour, and this is an astonishing rate of death again. In people are just waving swords around. The Romans, as those described it, the Roman soldiers had been without water for and again, when you're fighting a battle on a hot day, carrying those sort of the armour and so on, then the Roman soldiers were just so exhausted from thirst and the heat and so on that they were committing suicide rather than wait to be killed by the Carthaginians. Some were allegedly digging holes in the ground and burying their heads in it and covering them with soil and so on to suffocate themselves. Such was the state of delirium in that heat and that thirst. Once the Carthaginians had surrounded the Romans, then they had no access to water or anything like that. And in that sort of heat and those sort of battle conditions, many would have expired or been in effect useless as soldiers, as fighting men, due to the fatigue and the thirst and so on. So that was the battle of Cannae, an astonishing accomplishment. And while nothing should be taken away from Hannibal's battlefield generalship, his sense of timing over things and the ability to command the loyalty of so many different nationalities, this again is an outstanding achievement. But I would argue that even more than his generalship was his the quality of the military intelligence and the information he got, and his ability to determine what was reliable information, what wasn't. What we see following Cannae is that Hannibal never really had a substantial success beyond that. Sure, there's some skirmishes. Sure, he got the better of the Romans here and there, but there was, apart from the Romans' reluctance to fight a pitched battle, Hannibal was never able to command an intelligence network of that quality again. And when finally he had the Battle of Zama in 202 BC outside of Carthage, the Romans were able to bribe key Carthaginian allies to change sides, and Hannibal's intelligence network didn't pick that up until it was too late, and that was primary in resulting in his defeat in the Battle of Zama. But Cannae, Battle of Cannae, 400 kilometres southwest of Rome, represents one of the most stunning military achievements in military history back then and still today. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for joining me.